You know those big stories we tell ourselves? The ones about our values, our history, even about science itself? What if the foundations of those stories aren't as solid as we think? In this explainer, we're going to dig into some sources that really challenge our most basic assumptions.
See, the sources we're diving into here, they don't just say our stories are missing a few details. No, they argue we might be missing the entire point. So let's start with a big one, the values that are supposed to be holding everything together.
So, first up, a question of values. How are we actually doing? Well, according to our sources, there are some pretty concerning trends out there, especially with young people, and they've got some, well, pretty startling numbers to make their case. Okay, so check out this number, 64%. It's a big one, from a huge survey on student ethics. But 64% of what exactly?
Yeah, that's the percentage of high school students in a survey of nearly 30,000 of them who admitted they cheated on a test. Wow. So the sources use this to ask a really tough question. Are we saying one thing and doing another?
But hold on. It's not as simple as just pointing fingers. I mean, listen to this quote. The argument here is that maybe the real problem is the pressure cooker environment we've created, where cutting corners starts to feel like the only way to succeed. And there's another angle to this, a cultural one. The sources bring up these anecdotes from schools. Stories about kids being told not to write Merry Christmas, or that a drawing about Jesus was inappropriate. The point they're making is that this creates a feeling that faith is something you're supposed to keep to yourself, or maybe even be a little ashamed of.
Okay, so this whole idea of re-examining our stories, it doesn't just stop with today's values. It goes way back into our history. The sources argue we have this habit of turning real, complicated people into simple heroes or villains. And a prime example they use is the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. We think we know him, right? The image is kind of carved in stone. But the argument is that if you actually look at his own words and actions, the picture gets way more complicated. And honestly, kind of surprising. Get this. In a letter, years before the Civil War, Lee himself called slavery a moral and political evil. Now, to be crystal clear, the sources aren't trying to excuse his later actions. The whole point is just to show that history is messy, and the simple stories we tell, well, they often leave out these really complex details. And this story really drives it home. Right after the war, Lee is in church, and he walks up and kneels for communion right next to a black man. The account says the all-white congregation was just stunned. How do you fit an act like that into a simple villain box? You can't. It's just complicated. All right, now we're going to pivot to what is honestly the most provocative argument in these sources. It's a fundamental challenge to the story we tell about science itself. And we're not talking about questioning scientific findings, but something much deeper. Where did the idea of science even come from? I mean, we all know the usual story, right? Science versus religion, the big showdown. But these sources flip that script completely. They make this startling claim that the very foundation of science, the idea that the universe makes sense and we can figure it out, didn't happen in spite of a Judeo-Christian worldview. It happened because of it. And it all boils down to how you think about time. Seriously, think about it. If you see time as a big circle, just repeating forever, there's no real forward movement, no real progress. But if you see time as a line with a start, a middle, and a finish, then suddenly cause and effect makes sense. Progress is possible. And according to the sources, that linear view was the secret ingredient science needed to get started. So, okay, if a linear view of time is so important, that begs a huge question. Why didn't science as we know it really take off in other great ancient civilizations? The argument here is that their core philosophies actually got in the way. If you believe the world isn't real or that nature is totally unpredictable, well, it's pretty hard to build a scientific method on that foundation. And this brings us to the absolute heart of the argument, the idea of a single, rational creator who designed an orderly universe with consistent laws. That was a total game changer. It gave early thinkers the confidence to believe the cosmos wasn't just random chaos. It was a system. It had laws. It could be studied and understood, like a book just waiting to be read.
But the critique doesn't just stay in the past. It comes right into the present day. The sources argue that even modern science, as powerful as it is, can get trapped by its own assumptions, turning a method for discovery into a kind of dogma.
And junk DNA is their poster child for this idea. For decades, the assumption was that huge parts of our genome were just useless evolutionary leftovers. So nobody really studied them. It took years and years to discover that this so-called junk is actually incredibly important. It helps regulate how our genes work. The starting assumption literally hindered discovery. And you know what? It's kind of the same story with so-called vestigial organs. For a long time, there was this list of supposedly useless body parts, like the appendix or tonsils, but as medical science advanced, that list just kept getting shorter and shorter as we found out, oh wait, those actually do really important things. This quote from the biologist Richard Lewontin is just wow. It's incredibly blunt. He admits that science has a pre-existing commitment to only material explanations. And he says it isn't based on evidence, but is an absolute philosophical rule because, in his words, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So where does all this lead? It all builds to this final, really powerful argument that the real conflict we see today isn't really about the scientific data itself, it's about the two competing philosophical lenses we use to view that data. The first lens is methodological naturalism. This is basically the ground rule of modern science. It doesn't say nothing supernatural exists, it just says that when you're doing science, you can only look for natural causes. That's the rule of the game. The second lens is interventionism. This view agrees that nature usually runs on consistent laws, for sure, but it leaves the door open to the idea that a creator or some intelligence may have stepped in at key moments in history, like the origin of life. And here is the crucial takeaway. The sources are trying to completely reframe the entire debate. It's not science versus faith. It's a clash between two competing philosophies. Both sides are looking at the same fossils, the same DNA, the same universe, but they're interpreting that evidence through two fundamentally different sets of assumptions about reality.
And so that leaves us with this final, really challenging question. If our starting assumptions, our lenses, shape our conclusions, how do we ever step outside of them? How do we decide which story is the right one to see the world through?